"I'm not worth much, but I'll open my legs for a warm bed," she said to the lonely cowboy. "Have you ever met someone who couldn't see their own worth? Someone so broken by the world that they measured their value in the basest terms imaginable?" "I have. And the night she stumbled onto my land, offering herself like she was nothing more than currency to be spent, she changed everything I thought I knew about loneliness, about love, and about what it truly means to save another person's soul. My name is Silas Hartwell, and in the winter of 1887, I was the loneliest man in all of Wyoming Territory. I stood 6 feet and 7 inches tall, built like a draft horse from years of breaking land and cattle alike. My hands were rough as saddle leather, my shoulders broad enough to carry feed sacks 2 at a time, and my heart had grown so cold I'd nearly forgotten it still beat inside my chest. I was 34 years old, and I had not spoken to another living soul in nearly 3 weeks when the blizzard came howling down from the Bighorn Mountains like the wrath of God himself. I had made my peace with solitude. After what happened with my brother, after the war, after everything I'd seen and done, I figured isolation was exactly what a man like me deserved. I ran 1,200 head of cattle across 6,000 acres of Wyoming grassland, with the nearest town of Clearwater sitting some 20 miles to the southeast. I made that journey perhaps once a month for supplies, spoke as few words as necessary, and returned to my stone ranch house built into the hillside where the wind couldn't quite reach. I had 3 horses, a milk cow, chickens that laid eggs whether I wanted them to or not, and absolutely no intention of ever sharing my life with another human being. The ranch had been nothing but empty grassland when I first arrived in Wyoming, 10 years before that fateful winter. I had built everything from nothing, using my bare hands and the skills my father had taught me back in Pennsylvania. The main house had taken me 2 full summers to complete, hauling stones from the creek bed 3 miles distant, cutting timber from the forests that clung to the mountain slopes. Every stone I laid was a prayer for forgiveness. Every board I nailed was a promise to the brother I had failed to save. The barn came next, then the corrals, then the bunkhouse that I had built with the optimism of a man who thought he might one day hire hands to help with the work. The bunkhouse sat empty now, had sat empty for years, because I had discovered that I preferred the company of cattle to the company of men. Cattle did not ask questions. Cattle did not look at you with pity in their eyes. Cattle did not remind you of the screams and the blood and the terrible weight of a dying man in your arms. The storm had been building for 2 days when I first saw her. I was in the barn, checking on my horses and making sure the livestock had enough feed to last through what promised to be the worst weather I'd seen in 5 years. The snow was already knee-deep, and the wind had teeth sharp enough to cut through buffalo hide. I was about to seal up the barn doors when I saw something moving across the white expanse of my lower pasture. At first, I thought it was a coyote, or perhaps a wolf come down from the mountains seeking shelter. But the shape was wrong, too tall, moving with a strange, stumbling gait that spoke of exhaustion rather than predatory intent. I grabbed my rifle from where it hung by the barn door and stepped out into the howling wind. The cold hit me like a physical blow, even through my sheepskin coat and wool layers. I squinted against the driving snow, watching that dark shape grow closer. And my heart did something strange in my chest when I realized it was a person. A woman, from the looks of the tattered dress whipping around thin legs. She was walking directly into the wind, arms wrapped around herself, and even from 50 yards away, I could see she was barely staying upright. I left the rifle leaning against the barn wall and started toward her. The snow dragged at my boots, slowing me down, but I pushed through with the determination of a man who had spent his whole life fighting against things that wanted to stop him. When I was close enough to see her face, something inside me cracked open like river ice in spring. She was young, perhaps 20 or 22, with hair that might have been brown but was so caked with ice and snow that it looked white. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as the drifts around us, and her eyes, God help me, her eyes were the saddest thing I had ever seen. They were gray, like storm clouds before the rain, and they looked at me with a mixture of fear and resignation that made my stomach turn. She stopped walking when she saw me coming toward her, and for a moment I thought she might run. But she was too far gone for that, too cold, too exhausted. Instead, she just stood there, swaying in the wind, like a young aspen tree, and waited for me to reach her. I did not know what to say. I had forgotten how to speak to people, especially women. Especially beautiful broken women who appeared out of blizzards like apparitions sent to test a man's resolve. So I simply stopped in front of her, close enough that my body blocked some of the wind, and waited for her to speak first. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the wind, cracked and raw like she had been screaming or crying or both, and the words she said, the words that would haunt me for the rest of my days, came out with a kind of hollow practicality that made my blood run cold. She said she was not worth much. She said she would open her legs for a warm bed. She called me a lonely cowboy, as if she could see right through to the emptiness inside me with those storm-gray eyes. And then she just stood there, waiting for me to accept her offer, waiting for me to use her up like everyone else apparently had. I had never hit a woman in my life. I had seen men do it, during the war and after, and I had always thought them the lowest form of creature to walk the earth. But in that moment, standing in the howling wind with snow burning my face, I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she understood how wrong she was. I wanted to roar at her that no woman should ever have to say such words, that no human being should be reduced to offering their body like a handful of coins in exchange for basic survival. Instead, I took off my sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders. She flinched at my touch, which told me more about her past than any words could have, but she did not pull away. The coat swallowed her whole, hanging past her knees, and she clutched it closed with fingers so cold they looked waxy and dead. I said one word. Just one. I said, "Come." And then I turned and started walking back toward the ranch house, not looking behind me to see if she followed. I knew she would. She had nowhere else to go. The walk to the house took perhaps 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. The wind screamed around us, throwing snow in horizontal sheets that stung like needles. I could hear her footsteps crunching in the snow behind me, uneven and stumbling, and twice I slowed my pace to let her catch up. I did not offer her my arm or try to help her walk. Something told me that she needed to make this journey on her own 2 feet, that she had been carried and dragged and forced by too many hands already. My house was not much to look at from the outside, just a low stone structure built half into the hillside with a steep timber roof designed to shed snow. But inside, it was warm and dry, with thick walls that kept out the wind and a massive stone fireplace that I had built myself from river rocks hauled up from the creek 3 miles distant. I had a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a bedroom with a real bed frame and feather mattress, and a second smaller room that I used for storing supplies and tack that needed repair. It was not a palace, but it was mine, and I had made it comfortable in the way that a man living alone learns to do. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside, holding it open behind me for her to follow. She hesitated on the threshold, looking around at the interior with those sad grey eyes, and I wondered what she saw. Probably just a bachelor's dwelling, sparse and utilitarian, with no woman's touch to soften the edges. There were no curtains on the windows, no flowers in vases, no decorative touches of any kind. Just a worn rag rug before the fire, a heavy oak table with 2 chairs that had never held a second occupant, and walls lined with books that I had read so many times I could recite passages from memory. She stepped inside, and I closed the door against the wind. The sudden silence was almost deafening after the roar of the storm. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, and the crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the pounding of my own heart, which had not beat this fast in years. I went to the fireplace and added 2 more logs, building up the blaze until waves of heat rolled out into the room. Then I turned to look at her properly for the first time since I had wrapped my coat around her shoulders. She was half frozen, her dress so thin it might as well have been paper, her feet shod in boots that had holes worn through the soles. She had no coat, no hat, no gloves, and I could not fathom how she had survived long enough to reach my land. The distance to anything resembling civilization was miles, and the storm had been raging for hours before I saw her stumbling across my pasture. I asked her name, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. It came out rough anyway, unused to forming words, rusty from weeks of silence. She told me her name was Violet Crane, and then she started to cry. The tears came silently at first, streaming down her frozen cheeks without sound. and then her shoulders began to shake, and suddenly she was sobbing with the kind of raw, animal grief that comes from a place beyond words. She stood there in my doorway, wrapped in my sheepskin coat, crying like her heart was breaking all over again, and I did not know what to do. I am not a man given to displays of emotion. The war burned that out of me, along with so much else. But something about her tears reached past all my defenses, past all the walls I had built around myself, and touched something soft and wounded that I had thought long dead. I found myself crossing the room in 2 long strides, found my arms going around her thin shoulders, found myself pulling her against my chest and holding her while she wept. She was so small against me. The top of her head barely reached my shoulder, and I could feel her bones through the sheepskin coat, sharp and bird-like beneath my hands. She smelled like snow and wood smoke and something floral that might have been soap, faint and fading. And as I held her, feeling her body shake with sobs, I made a silent vow that I would find out who had broken her so badly, and I would make them pay. The crying lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt much longer. Gradually the sobs subsided into hiccups, and the hiccups into silence, and finally she pulled back from my chest and looked up at me with those storm-grey eyes, now red-rimmed and swollen. She apologized. Said she did not usually fall apart like that on strangers. I told her that she had nothing to apologize for, that any person would cry after walking through a blizzard half-frozen to death, that I was just glad she had found her way to my door instead of dying out there in the snow. She looked at me strangely when I said that last part, as if dying in the snow had been a genuine consideration, a real option that she had weighed against coming to my door. I led her to the chair closest to the fire and sat her down. Then I went to the kitchen and put water on to boil, dug out the tin of tea that I kept for special occasions that never came, and found the last of the honey that I had traded for in Clearwater the month before. While I waited for the water to heat, I pulled blankets from my bedroom and brought them out, wrapping them around her until she looked like a small, sad caterpillar bundled up before the fire. She watched me move around the room with those grey eyes, tracking my every movement like a prey animal watching a predator. I pretended not to notice, giving her space, keeping my movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. When the tea was ready, I brought it to her in my best china cup, the one my mother had given me before she passed, and I pressed it into her cold hands with instructions to drink slowly. She took a sip, and something in her face changed. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders, and her eyes lost a fraction of their wariness. She thanked me, and her voice was stronger now, less like a ghost and more like a living woman. I sat down in the other chair, across the fire from her, and waited. I had learned patience during the war, during the long years of rebuilding afterward, and I knew that some stories needed to come out in their own time. She would tell me what had happened to her, or she would not. Either way, I would not force her. The fire crackled between us, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall, and I knew that we were both trapped here now, prisoner to the storm and to whatever strange fate had brought her stumbling across my land. She started talking somewhere around her 3rd cup of tea. The story came out in fits and starts, circling back on itself, leaving gaps that I could fill in with my imagination. She had been married, she said, at 16, to a man twice her age who had paid her father $50 for the privilege of taking her away from the family farm in Kansas. Her father had needed the money for seed and equipment, and her mother had needed one less mouth to feed, and no one had bothered to ask Violet what she wanted. His name was Harold Crane, and he had seemed respectable enough when he came courting. He owned a small farm outside of Topeka, wore clean clothes to church on Sundays, and spoke politely to her parents. Violet had been flattered by his attention, too young and sheltered to recognize the warning signs that an older woman might have seen. The way his eyes lingered too long on her developing body. The way he spoke to her like she was a child to be instructed rather than a person with thoughts and opinions of her own. The way he grew cold and distant whenever she expressed a preference that did not align with his own. The wedding had been a simple affair, performed in her parents' parlor with only family present. She had worn her mother's dress, too big in the bodice and too short in the hem, and she had promised to love, honor, and obey a man she barely knew. That night, in his farmhouse 20 miles from the only home she had ever known. She had learned what obey really meant. She did not go into detail about what happened in that farmhouse bedroom, and I did not ask. Some things do not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. But I could read between the lines of her halting words, could see the shadows that crossed her face when she spoke of her husband's demands. He had been rough with her, impatient, interested only in his own pleasure, and unconcerned with her pain or fear. And when she cried, he had told her to be quiet, that this was her duty as a wife, that she should be grateful any man wanted her at all. The husband had been cruel in other ways too, she said. Not violent at first, but controlling, jealous, quick to find fault and slow to forgive. He had isolated her from the few friends she had managed to make, had worked her like a mule from dawn to dusk, had criticized everything. From the way she cooked his meals to the way she braided her hair, nothing she did was ever good enough for Harold Crane. No amount of effort could earn his approval or his affection. She had tried in those early months to be a good wife. She had scrubbed his floors until her hands cracked and bled. She had cooked his meals exactly the way he liked them, had mended his clothes with perfect stitches, had submitted to his needs in the marriage bed without complaint. But her efforts only seemed to fuel his contempt. The more she tried to please him, the more he found to criticize, until she began to believe that she truly was as worthless as he said. The violence started in the second year of their marriage, a slap across the face when she burned his dinner, a shove that sent her sprawling when she spoke out of turn, a kick to her ribs when she failed to rise quickly enough to his command. He was always careful to hit her where the bruises would not show, always apologetic afterward, always promising it would never happen again. And she believed him because she wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The marriage had lasted 4 years. 4 years of misery, of feeling worthless, of being told daily that she was stupid, ugly, useless, lucky that any man would have her. And then her husband had taken sick with something in his lungs, and within 3 weeks, he was dead, and Violet was alone with a farm she could not run and debts she could not pay. She had felt guilty, she admitted, for the relief that washed through her when the doctor pronounced him dead. Guilty for the lightness in her chest when they lowered his coffin into the ground. She had stood by his grave in her black dress, playing the part of the grieving widow, and inside she had felt nothing but a terrible, shameful freedom. But freedom, she learned quickly, was not free for women in her position. The creditors had come within a month. They had taken the farm, the livestock, everything except the clothes on her back and a single suitcase of belongings. She had written to her parents, hoping they might take her in, and received a brief letter in return informing her that they had troubles of their own and could not support another mouth. She was on her own. She had travelled to Clearwater, hoping to find work. Any kind of work that would keep her fed and sheltered. The journey had taken 3 days by coach, and she had spent most of her remaining money on the fare. But Clearwater was a small town, suspicious of strangers, and no one had been willing to hire a young widow with no references and no skills beyond farming and housekeeping. She had applied for work at the general store, the hotel, the restaurant, the laundry. Everywhere she went, she received the same response. Polite refusals, suspicious looks, doors closing in her face. She was too young, they said, too pretty, too unknown. A woman alone was a woman of questionable virtue, and no respectable business wanted to be associated with questionable virtue. She had spent her last coins on a room at the boarding house, and when that money ran out, the landlady had turned her out into the street. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of walking from farm to ranch to homestead, begging for work, offering to clean or cook or sew in exchange for a meal and a place to sleep. And when the work was not available, she had offered the only thing she had left. She said those words without emotion, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of beef. Some of the men had accepted her offer, she said. Some had not. But none of them had given her more than a single night's shelter, and when morning came, she had been shown the door and pointed toward the next property. The first time, she told me, had been the hardest. A rancher, with a wife and children asleep in the main house, who had taken her to the barn and used her quickly, roughly, then given her a cold biscuit and sent her on her way. She had vomited behind his barn afterward, then wiped her mouth and started walking to the next farm. Because what else could she do? She had no money, no family, no skills that anyone valued. Her body was the only currency she possessed. She had lost track of how long she had been walking when the blizzard caught her. Hours, probably. Maybe a day. She had stopped being able to feel her feet somewhere around noon, and she had known, with the calm certainty of the dying, that she would not survive another night in the cold. And then she had seen my barn rising up out of the snow, and she had used the last of her strength to reach it. She looked at me across the fire when she finished speaking, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite hope, but was perhaps the distant cousin of it. She asked if I would accept her offer, now that I knew what she was. Now that I knew she had been used by other men, passed around like a worn coin. She said she understood if I found her disgusting, if I wanted nothing to do with her soiled body. But if I would let her stay just until the storm passed, she would make it worth my while. I stood up from my chair so abruptly that she flinched backward, fear flashing across her face. I saw it, that fear, and it made something dark and angry rise up in my chest. Not anger at her, never at her. Anger at every man who had ever touched her wrong, who had made her believe that her body was her only worth, who had taught her to flinch from sudden movement. I crossed to where she sat bundled in blankets and dropped to one knee before her chair, bringing myself down to her level so she would not have to crane her neck to look up at me. I took her cold hands in mine, carefully, gently, the way a man might hold a wounded bird. I told her that I did not want her body, not like that. Not as payment for simple human kindness. I told her that she was welcome to stay in my home for as long as she needed, that there was a spare room where she could sleep, that I expected nothing in return except perhaps some help with the cooking, if she felt up to it. I told her that she was worth more than she knew, worth more than the sum of what had been done to her, worth more than any man had the right to take without giving in return. She stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Like the concept of kindness without conditions was so alien to her experience that she could not parse the meaning. And then, slowly, tears began to slide down her cheeks again, and she asked me why. Why would I help her? What did I want from her? I told her the truth. I told her that I was lonely, that I had been alone for so long I had forgotten what it meant to share space with another living soul. I told her that, seeing her stumble across my pasture, half dead from cold, had awakened something in me that I thought had died years ago. I told her that I did not know what would happen tomorrow, or next week, or next month, but for tonight, all I wanted was to know that she was warm and safe and fed. She did not quite believe me. I could see it in her eyes, the suspicion, the waiting for the other shoe to drop. But she was too exhausted to argue, too cold and hungry and worn down to do anything but accept my words at face value. She nodded just once, and I released her hands and stood. I made her soup from the beef broth I kept simmering on the back of the stove, thick with potatoes and carrots and onions. She ate 2 bowls while I watched, then a third, eating with the focused intensity of someone who has learned never to take food for granted. When she was done, I showed her to the spare room, which was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the pasture where I had first seen her. I gave her one of my shirts to sleep in, the softest flannel I owned, and I left a basin of warm water for her to wash with. Then I bid her good night and closed the door behind me, and I went to sit by the fire and wonder what in God's name I was going to do with a broken woman sleeping under my roof. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my chair by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about everything she had told me. Thinking about her husband, Harold Crane, and the things he had done to her in the name of marriage. Thinking about the men who had used her body and then sent her on her way, treating her like a piece of livestock to be borrowed and returned. Thinking about a world that could reduce a woman to such desperate measures and wondering what my own part in that world might be. I thought about Thomas, too. My brother, who had died at Gettysburg with his hand in mine and his blood soaking into the Pennsylvania soil. Thomas, who had been the better man in every way, kinder and braver and more deserving of life. Thomas, who had stepped in front of a Confederate bullet, meant for me and had paid for that moment of brotherly love with his own existence. I had spent 20 years trying to be worthy of Thomas's sacrifice, 20 years of hard work and isolation, of building something from nothing, of trying to create meaning in a life that should have ended on that battlefield. And in all those years, I had never once considered that perhaps the best way to honor my brother's memory was not to wall myself off from the world, but to reach out and help someone else the way he had helped me. The storm raged for 3 more days. 3 days of howling wind and driving snow, of temperatures so cold that the water in the horse trough froze solid overnight. 3 days of Violet and me, trapped together in my small stone house, learning to navigate each other's presence. She was skittish at first, jumping at every sudden noise, going quiet and still whenever I moved too fast or spoke too loud. She insisted on earning her keep, even though I told her repeatedly that it was not necessary. She cleaned my house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors that had not seen soap in months, washing windows, beating rugs. She took over the cooking entirely after the first day, and I discovered that she had a talent for making simple ingredients into something that tasted like home. I gave her space. I had plenty of work to keep me busy, repairing tack, mending fences from the comfort of the barn, tending to the livestock. When we were in the house together, I kept to my chair by the fire, reading or whittling, while she moved around the kitchen or sat in her own chair, sewing patches onto her threadbare dress. We did not talk much those first few days. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, but it was wary, both of us circling each other like strange animals trying to determine friend from foe. I could see her watching me when she thought I was not looking, studying my movements, trying to predict what I might do next. And I watched her too, cataloguing the small ways she was different from the ghost who had stumbled out of the blizzard. She ate more, for one thing. The hollow look in her cheeks began to fill out, and some color returned to her skin. She moved more confidently around the house, no longer tiptoeing as if she expected to be struck at any moment. And occasionally, rarely, I would catch the ghost of a smile on her lips, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. On the second night, I heard her crying in her room, soft, muffled sobs that she was trying to hide, probably convinced that I could not hear them through the walls. I lay in my bed and listened, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, fighting the urge to go to her. She needed to cry, I told myself. She needed to release the poison that had been building up inside her for years. And she needed to do it alone, without a stranger hovering over her, no matter how well-intentioned. On the third morning, she asked me about the books on my walls. It was the first question she had asked that was not about practical matters, the first sign of curiosity about something beyond mere survival. I told her about my mother, who had taught me to read and had instilled in me a love of literature that the war could not destroy. I told her about the traveling bookseller who came through Clearwater twice a year and the small fortune I had spent over the years adding to my collection. She asked if she might borrow one, and I told her she could read any book she wanted. Her face lit up in a way I had not seen before, a genuine smile that transformed her features and made her look impossibly young. She spent the rest of that day curled up in her chair by the fire, lost in a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, and I found myself reading the same page over and over because I could not stop looking at her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to relax. The flinching became less frequent. Her voice grew stronger. She started to meet my eyes when she spoke to me, instead of keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. And she began to talk, really talk, about things beyond her sad history. She told me about growing up on her family's farm in Kansas, about her mother's garden and her father's quiet pride in his wheat fields. She told me about the games she had played with her sisters, about the one-room schoolhouse where she had learned to read and write, about the dreams she had harbored as a girl of traveling to distant cities and seeing the world beyond the flat Kansas plains. She told me about her younger brother, who had died of scarlet fever when he was 7, and how she still missed him every day. She told me about the books she had loved as a girl before marriage stole her time for reading, and I found myself pulling volumes from my shelves and pressing them into her hands. In turn, I told her about myself, about growing up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, about the sound of my father's hammer ringing on the anvil, about the smell of hot metal and coal smoke that had defined my childhood, about my mother's gentle hands braiding my hair, about her voice reading aloud to Thomas and me by candlelight, About the pride I had felt the first time my father let me work the bellows, the first time he trusted me to hammer a horseshoe into shape. I told her about my older brother Thomas, who had been my best friend and my hero until the war came and changed everything. Thomas, who had taught me to fish and hunt, who had defended me against bullies, who had once taken a beating from our father rather than let me be punished for a window I had broken. Thomas, who had enlisted the day after Fort Sumter fell, fire in his eyes and certainty in his heart that the war would be over in months. I told her about following Thomas into the army, about the naive excitement of our first weeks in uniform, about how quickly that excitement had curdled into horror, about the terrible things I had seen at Antietam and Gettysburg, the blood and the screaming, and the friends dying in my arms, about the smell of gunpowder and rot, about the sound of men begging for their mothers as they bled out in the mud, about the night terrors that had plagued me for years afterward, that still visited me sometimes when the wind howled and the darkness pressed close. I told her about Thomas taking a bullet meant for me, dying in a field hospital 3 days later, while I held his hand and begged God to take me instead. About the look in his eyes when he realized he was dying, the way he had squeezed my hand and told me to live, to build something good, to make his death mean something. About the promise I had made him, there in that canvas tent with the sound of artillery echoing in the distance, that I would survive and I would create a life worth living. I told her how I had wandered west after the war, unable to return to a home that no longer felt like home, how I had worked as a ranch hand, then a foreman, then finally saved enough to buy my own land and start my own herd, how I had built this house with my own 2 hands, stone by stone, wanting to create something permanent in a world that had shown me how quickly everything could be destroyed. She listened to all of it, her gray eyes soft with understanding, and when I finished speaking, she reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. Just held it without speaking, and I felt something shift inside my chest like a key turning in a lock. By the 4th day, the storm had blown itself out. The sun rose over a world transformed, everything buried under 3 feet of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the cold light. I went out to check on the livestock and found them all alive, huddled together for warmth in the barn. The cattle in the far pastures had drifted with the storm, but I could see dark shapes moving against the white, which meant most of them had survived. When I came back inside, stamping snow from my boots, Violet was standing by the window, looking out at the pristine landscape. She asked if it was safe to travel now, if the roads to Clearwater would be passable, and something in her voice made my heart sink because I knew what she was really asking. I told her the roads would not be clear for at least a week. The snow was too deep, the drifts too high. Even with a horse, the journey would be dangerous, possibly deadly. She nodded, her face unreadable, and went back to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The week passed, then another. The snow began to melt, slowly, revealing the brown grass of late winter beneath. I could have taken her to town, should have, probably. But every time I thought about putting her on a horse and watching her ride away, something inside me rebelled, and she did not ask again about leaving. We fell into a routine, she and I. She took over the household tasks entirely, cooking and cleaning and mending, while I focused on the ranch work. We ate together, 3 meals a day at my heavy oak table. We read together in the evenings, sitting by the fire with our books, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other. And slowly, without either of us acknowledging it, we began to build something that felt like a life. I found myself looking forward to coming inside at the end of a long day, knowing she would be there. Found myself lingering over meals, just to spend more time in her company. Found myself lying awake at night, thinking about the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, about the sound of her voice singing softly as she worked, about the warmth of her hand in mine that evening by the fire. She was changing too. The hollows in her cheeks were filling out, her skin losing its pale, sickly pallor. She smiled more often, laughed occasionally, and the shadows in her grey eyes seemed to lift a little more each day. She stopped flinching when I moved suddenly, stopped tensing when I stood too close. She began to seek out my company instead of avoiding it, joining me in the barn while I worked, asking questions about the cattle and the land. One afternoon in late February, I found her in the chicken coop, talking to the hens like they were old friends. She had names for each of them, she told me, blushing slightly at my amused expression. Henrietta was the bossy one who pecked the other hens away from the best scraps. Clementine was the gentle one who let the others eat first. And Duchess was the prettiest, with her glossy red feathers and proud strut. I listened to her chatter about the chickens, and I realized that I was smiling. A real smile, not the polite grimace I put on for strangers in town. I had not smiled like that in years, had not felt the muscles in my face relax into genuine happiness. And when she looked up and caught me smiling at her, she blushed again, and something warm kindled in my chest. Spring came, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. The snow melted, the creeks ran high with meltwater, and green shoots began to push up through the brown grass. I took her riding across the ranch, showing her the boundaries of my land, the high meadows where the cattle would graze in summer, the hidden valley where a hot spring sent steam rising into the cold mountain air. She had never been on a horse before, or at least not for pleasure. I taught her to ride, starting slow, walking circuits around the corral until she felt comfortable in the saddle. I gave her my gentlest mare, a chestnut named Copper, who had more patience than most human beings I knew. Violet was tentative at first, gripping the reins too tightly and sitting too stiffly, but she listened to my instructions and adjusted her posture until she began to move with the horse rather than against it. She was a quick learner, fearless in a way that surprised me, and soon she was galloping beside me across the open range, her hair streaming behind her and laughter bubbling from her lips. The sound of her laughter became one of my favorite things in the world, bright and pure, and full of a joy that she had been denied for too long. It was on one of those rides, a warm afternoon in late April, that everything changed. We had stopped to rest the horses by a small creek, the water running clear and cold with snowmelt from the mountains. Violet was sitting on a fallen log, her face turned up to the sun, her eyes closed in simple pleasure. She looked so beautiful in that moment, so alive and present and real, that I could not help myself. I crossed to where she sat, took her face in my hands, and kissed her. She went very still beneath my lips. For one terrible moment I thought I had ruined everything, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But then her hands came up to grip the front of my shirt, and she kissed me back with a hunger that took my breath away. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, she looked up at me with those storm-gray eyes and asked why I had done that. I told her the truth. I told her that I had fallen in love with her, that I had been falling since the moment she stumbled out of that blizzard and into my life. I told her that I wanted to spend the rest of my days making her feel safe and valued and cherished if she would let me. She started to cry again, but this time the tears were different. There was joy mixed in with the sorrow, hope rising up through the pain. She told me that she did not understand how I could love her, damaged as she was. She told me that she had nothing to offer me, no dowry, no family connections, no skills beyond cooking and cleaning. She told me that I deserved better. I pulled her close and held her while she cried, and when the tears subsided, I told her that she was everything I wanted, that her past did not define her, that the things that had been done to her were not her fault, that she was worthy of love simply because she existed. I told her that I had been dead inside for years, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive, and that she had brought me back to life just by being herself. She asked if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything. And then I asked her to marry me, right there by the creek, with the horses grazing nearby and the spring sun warming our faces. She said yes. The word burst out of her, half laugh and half sob, and then she threw her arms around my neck and kissed me again. And I knew that my life had changed forever. We stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, talking about the future, making plans, dreaming dreams that neither of us would have dared to dream alone. When we finally rode back to the ranch, the stars were coming out overhead, and Violet's hand was clasped tightly in mine. The days between the proposal and the wedding were some of the strangest of my life. I had grown accustomed to my solitude, to moving through the world without anyone to answer to or care for. Now, suddenly, I was planning a future with another person, making decisions that would affect us both, learning to think in terms of we instead of I. We rode to Clearwater together to speak with Reverend Patterson about the ceremony. The old man listened to our story, or at least the parts of it we were willing to share, and he agreed to marry us without hesitation. He was a practical man who had seen enough of life to know that love did not always come in neat, respectable packages. When Violet confessed that she had been married before, that her first husband had died and left her destitute, the Reverend simply nodded and said that God gives second chances to those who need them. We spent that day in town, the first time we had ventured into Clearwater together as something other than rancher and guest. I introduced her to the people I knew, the shopkeepers and tradesmen who had provided my supplies over the years. I watched their faces as they met her, saw the curiosity in their eyes. The questions they were too polite to ask. A few of them recognized her, I could tell, remembered the desperate widow who had come begging for work months before. But if they remembered the circumstances of her departure, they kept that knowledge to themselves. We bought supplies for the wedding, simple things that felt momentous nonetheless. A dress for Violet, blue cotton with white lace, the nicest thing she had ever owned. New boots to replace the worn pair she had been wearing since before the blizzard. A ribbon for her hair, dark green that matched the dress's trim. I watched her try on the dress in the back room of the general store, and when she came out, turning slowly so I could see how it hung on her frame, I felt my heart catch in my throat. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, even half frozen and desperate, but now, with health restored and hope kindling in her eyes, she was radiant. The dress fit her perfectly, skimming her curves without clinging too tightly, modest enough for a church wedding but flattering nonetheless. She asked if I liked it, her voice uncertain, still not quite believing that she was allowed to have nice things. I told her she looked like an angel. She blushed and ducked her head, but I could see the pleasure in her smile. We stopped at the jeweler's shop before we left town. I had never had occasion to enter it before, had never needed the services of a man who sold rings and watches and fancy things for fancy people. But now I pushed open the door and led Violet inside, ignoring her protests that she did not need a ring, that I should not spend money on frivolous things. The jeweler was a small man, with spectacles and nimble fingers, and he seemed delighted to have customers. He showed us tray after tray of rings, gold bands and silver bands, plain and decorated, set with stones of every color. Violet's eyes went wide at the selection, wider still at the prices inscribed on the small tags. She tried to steer me toward the simplest bands, the ones that cost the least, but I was having none of it. I watched her face as she looked at the rings, watched her expression when her gaze fell on a particular piece. A gold band with a small ruby set into the top, not ostentatious but elegant, the red stone catching the light and throwing tiny sparks of fire. I asked her if she liked it. She said it was too expensive. I said that was not what I had asked. She looked at the ring again, then at me, and finally admitted that yes, she liked it. It was the most beautiful ring she had ever seen. I bought it. I bought the matching wedding band too, a plain gold ring that would sit beneath the ruby and proclaim to the world that she was mine. When the jeweler slipped the engagement ring onto her finger, Violet started to cry, and I held her right there in the middle of the shop, while the jeweler pretended to be very interested in organizing his inventory. The wedding itself was simple, as I mentioned, but the days leading up to it were filled with small moments of joy, intimate glimpses of the life we would build together. Violet planted flowers around the front door of our house, claiming them from the wild meadows and coaxing them to grow in the rocky soil. I fixed the squeaky hinge on the bedroom door that had been bothering me for years, wanting everything to be perfect for our wedding night. We cooked meals together, laughed together, talked late into the night about everything and nothing. She told me more about her childhood, about the games she had played with her sisters, about the books she had read by candlelight when she was supposed to be sleeping. I told her about Thomas, about the mischief we had gotten into as boys, about the summer we had spent building a raft and floating down the river. Certain we were the greatest explorers who had ever lived. We shared our sorrows and our joys, our fears and our hopes, and with each shared story, the bond between us grew stronger. One evening, about a week before the wedding, Violet asked me about children. Did I want them? Had I ever imagined being a father? I thought about the question carefully before answering, knowing how much weight it carried. I told her that I had never expected to have children, Never expected to have a wife. Never expected to have anyone in my life who would stay. But now, with her, I found that I wanted all of it. The family, the legacy, the noise and chaos of a household full of little ones. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then she told me that she was afraid. Her first marriage had been barren, and she did not know if the fault lay with her or with Harold. What if she could not give me children? What if I came to resent her for it, the way Harold had resented her for every other perceived failing? I took her face in my hands and looked into her grey eyes and told her that I would love her regardless. Children or no children, I would love her until the day I died. She was enough, just as she was. Anything else was a gift, not a requirement. She believed me. I could see the moment when she let go of that particular fear, when she allowed herself to trust that I meant what I said. And that night, when we made love for the first time, the physical consummation of the emotional bond we had already formed, it was with the understanding that our family had already begun. We two were family enough. We were married in Clearwater 3 weeks later in the small white church at the center of town. The preacher was a kind old man named Reverend Patterson, who asked no questions about Violet's past or her lack of family. He simply performed the ceremony, pronounced us man and wife, and wished us well. The church was mostly empty, just the Reverend's wife as witness and a few curious townspeople who had wandered in to see the reclusive rancher finally take a bride. Violet wore a dress we had purchased together at the general store, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar. It was simple, nothing like the elaborate gowns I had seen in pictures from back east, but she looked more beautiful to me than any society bride. Her hair was pinned up with wildflowers she had gathered that morning, and her grey eyes shone with a happiness I had once thought beyond her reach. I wore my best suit, the one I had bought 5 years earlier for a cattle auction I never attended. It was a bit tight across the shoulders. I had added muscle in the intervening years, but Violet said I looked handsome, and that was all that mattered. We celebrated with a meal at the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment run by a German immigrant named Heinrich and his wife, Maria. They served us roast beef and potatoes and apple pie, and Heinrich insisted on opening a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. We toasted to our future, to the life we would build together, and I felt like the luckiest man in the world. Then we rode home together, husband and wife, to the stone house built into the hillside. The sun was setting as we crested the last ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Violet gasped at the beauty of it. I stopped my horse, and we watched together as the colors deepened and faded, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, as the world settled into the quiet peace of evening. That night, for the first time, she came to my bed. Not as payment for kindness, not as an obligation or a duty, but as a wife coming to her husband out of love and desire. I will not speak in detail of what passed between us in the darkness, except to say that it was nothing like what she had experienced before. I was gentle, patient, attentive to her needs above my own. I touched her like she was precious, because she was. I whispered words of love against her skin, told her she was beautiful, told her she was safe, told her that I would never hurt her. There were moments when she tensed, when old fears rose up to threaten the intimacy we were building. In those moments, I stopped and held her, asking what she needed, giving her the power to set the pace. And slowly, with patience and tenderness, we found our way to each other. When she finally let go, when she allowed herself to feel pleasure instead of just enduring, the sound she made was the sweetest music I had ever heard. And when she fell asleep in my arms afterward, her head resting on my chest, I felt something I had not felt in decades. I felt happy. Truly, completely, unreservedly happy. The first year of our marriage was not without its challenges. Violet still had dark days, moments when the old fears and doubts rose up to swallow her whole. She would go quiet, withdrawing into herself, and I learned to give her space when she needed it, to simply be present without demanding anything. She still sometimes woke screaming from nightmares, memories of her first husband's cruelty bleeding into her dreams. I held her through those nights, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances until the trembling stopped. There were triggers we learned to navigate around. The sound of a belt being unbuckled could send her into a panic, so I switched to suspenders and never mentioned why. The smell of whiskey made her go pale and quiet, so I stopped keeping it in the house. A raised voice, even in jest, could make her flinch, so I learned to modulate my tone, to communicate frustration without volume. These adjustments were small prices to pay for her peace of mind. She had night terrors almost weekly in those early months. I would wake to find her thrashing in our bed, crying out in fear, fighting invisible enemies. The first time it happened, I tried to hold her, to comfort her, and she struck me in the face before waking fully, her eyes wild with terror. After that, I learned to wake her gently, to call her name from a distance, to give her time to orient herself before reaching for her. The dreams were always the same, she told me. Harold, drunk and angry, coming to her bed with violence in his eyes. Harold, calling her worthless, telling her she was nothing, that no one would ever want her. Harold, with his hands around her throat, squeezing until she could not breathe. She would wake gasping for air, convinced she was dying, and it would take long minutes for her to remember that Harold was dead, that she was safe, that she was home. I hated him. That dead man I had never met. Hated him with a ferocity that sometimes frightened me. I would lie awake after she had fallen back asleep, imagining what I would do to him if he were still alive, the punishments I would inflict for every bruise, every tear, every moment of terror he had caused her. It was not a Christian feeling, this hatred, but I could not help it. Some men did not deserve forgiveness. The healing was slow, gradual, measured in increments so small they were almost invisible. A week without nightmares, a month without flinching, a season without the shadow of sadness darkening her eyes. I celebrated each milestone silently, grateful for every step forward, patient when progress stalled or reversed. There were arguments too. We were both strong-willed people, both accustomed to doing things our own way, and learning to compromise was not always easy. I remember one fight about whether to sell some of the older cattle or keep them for breeding, both of us shouting things we did not mean, both of us too stubborn to back down. She had stormed out of the house, and I had let her go, fuming by the fire, convinced I was right and she was wrong. But she came back. She always came back, and we learned to apologize, to listen, to find solutions that worked for both of us. We learned that love was not just the easy moments, the laughter and the passion and the quiet contentment. Love was also the hard work of building a life together, the daily choice to stay and fight for something worth having. But the good days outnumbered the bad, and as the months passed, the dark days grew fewer and further between. She blossomed in ways I had not expected, growing confident and strong, taking on more and more responsibility for the running of the ranch. She learned to ride like a natural, to rope cattle, to mend fences. She kept the books, managing our finances with a sharp eye for detail that I lacked. And she transformed our house into a home, adding curtains to the windows, flowers on the table, all the small touches that made the space feel alive. We made the trip to Clearwater together once a month for supplies. The townspeople who had turned her away as a desperate widow now greeted her warmly as Mrs. Hartwell, wife of the successful rancher who ran the biggest spread in the territory. I watched her navigate these interactions with grace and dignity, never mentioning the rejection she had faced, never holding grudges. She was a better person than I would have been, in her place. In the autumn of our first year, she told me she was with child. I remember the moment clearly, standing in the kitchen with the afternoon light slanting through the window, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and fear. She was afraid, she admitted, afraid of childbirth, afraid of being a mother, afraid of repeating the patterns of her own childhood. I took her hands and told her that we would face it together, that she would never have to do anything alone again. The months of her pregnancy were a time of wonder and worry. I watched her body change, watched new life growing inside her, and felt an awe that bordered on the religious. I built a cradle from pine wood I cut and seasoned myself, carving flowers and vines into the headboard. I painted the spare room, turning it from a storage space into a nursery, while Violet sewed tiny clothes and blankets from fabric we bought in town. I was terrified, if I'm honest, terrified of becoming a father, of having another person depend on me, of the possibility of loss that parenthood implied. I had lost so much already, my brother, my parents, years of my life to war and its aftermath. The thought of loving a child, of being responsible for another life, filled me with a dread I could not fully articulate. But when Violet placed my hand on her swelling belly and I felt our child kick for the first time, the dread melted away. In its place was something fierce and protective, a love so powerful it frightened me. I would do anything for this child, I realized. Anything at all. Our daughter was born the following spring, on a warm May morning when the meadows were thick with wildflowers. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when I feared I would lose them both. I paced outside the bedroom door while the midwife from town did her work, listening to Violet's screams and feeling utterly helpless. I prayed, though I was not a praying man. I bargained with a God I was not sure I believed in, offering anything, everything, if he would just let them live. But Violet was strong, stronger than she knew, and by evening she was holding our daughter in her arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. I came into the room when the midwife called me, and I saw them there together, mother and child, and my heart stopped in my chest. We named her Rose, after my mother. She had her mother's grey eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she had us both wrapped around her tiny finger. I had not known I was capable of the love I felt for that child, fierce and protective and terrifying in its intensity. I would have moved mountains for her. I would have torn the world apart. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. We built onto the house, adding rooms to accommodate our growing family. The first addition was the nursery, of course, but as the children kept coming, we kept building. A room for Rose, decorated with the wildflowers she loved. A room for Thomas, sturdy and practical like the boy himself. A room for Sarah and later for James, each space reflecting the personality of its occupant. I hired hands finally, those bunkhouses seeing use after years of standing empty. The ranch had grown too large for one man to manage alone, and with a family to support, I could no longer afford the solitude I had once craved. Good men came and went over the years, some staying for seasons, others for decades. They became part of our extended family, eating at our table, celebrating our holidays, watching our children grow. After Rose came Thomas, named for my brother, a sturdy boy who took after me in size and temperament. From the moment he could walk, he was following me around the ranch, asking questions about everything, wanting to help with every task. He had my build, my dark hair, my stubborn jaw, but his eyes were his mother's, grey and thoughtful and kind. When he was 6, I put him on his first horse, and he took to riding like he had been born in the saddle. By 10, he could rope better than most of the hands. By 15, he was doing the work of a grown man and doing it well. Then came Sarah, quick and clever, always asking questions I could not answer. Where did the stars come from? Why did birds fly south in winter? What made the grass grow green? She exhausted me with her curiosity, but I loved every question, loved the sharp mind behind them. She was small like her mother, delicate in appearance, but there was steel in her spine and fire in her spirit. When the boys in town teased her for being too smart, she gave as good as she got, coming home with skinned knuckles and a defiant glare. And finally, little James, the baby of the family, spoiled shamelessly by his older siblings. He was a gentle soul, more interested in books than horses, more comfortable in the library than the barn. He had my mother's love of learning, her quiet appreciation for the written word. When he was old enough to read, he devoured every book in our house and then begged for more. We made special trips to Clearwater just to buy him new volumes, and he would disappear into his room for days at a time, emerging only for meals. Each child was different, each required different things from us as parents. Rose needed patience and encouragement, reassurance that she was loved. Thomas needed responsibility and challenge, something to strive toward. Sarah needed freedom and respect, acknowledgement of her intelligence. James needed space and acceptance, permission to be different from his siblings. Violet seemed to understand these needs instinctively, tailoring her approach to each child, giving them what they needed to flourish. I watched them grow, these children of ours, running wild through the meadows, learning to ride and rope alongside me. Rose was gentle like her mother, with a gift for soothing injured animals and frightened foals. Thomas was serious and hard-working, already showing signs of the rancher he would become. Sarah was a firecracker, all energy and curiosity, impossible to keep still or quiet. And James was the dreamer, always with his nose in a book, always asking questions about far-off places and people. Violet grew more beautiful with each passing year, the grey in her hair only adding to her grace, the lines on her face speaking of laughter and joy rather than sorrow. She never fully escaped the shadows of her past. There were still nights when she woke trembling, still moments when something would trigger a memory and send her spiraling into darkness. But those moments grew rarer, and she learned to weather them with a resilience that filled me with admiration. We celebrated holidays and birthdays, weathered droughts and blizzards, mourned the loss of livestock, and rejoiced in successful calvings. We argued and made up, laughed and cried, faced hardships together, and came through stronger. We built something real, something lasting, something that neither of us had believed possible when we first came together. Rose fell in love with a young rancher from the next valley, a good man named Samuel, who treated her well, and we celebrated their wedding in the same church where Violet and I had been married. I walked my daughter down the aisle, this girl who had once been a squalling infant in my arms, now a woman grown and ready to start her own family. I placed her hand in Samuel's and trusted him with her heart, the way Violet had once trusted me with hers. Samuel proved worthy of that trust. He was a hard-working man, honest and kind, who adored our Rose and made no secret of it. They built a homestead on the western edge of his family's land, close enough that we could visit often, far enough that they had their own space. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Violet after her grandmother, I thought my heart would burst with joy. Holding that tiny baby, seeing my wife's face reflected in those miniature features, I understood for the first time the blessing of grandchildren. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch work as I grew older, his strong hands and keen mind more than capable of managing what I had built. He had his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness, and he loved the land the way I did, with a fierce possessive pride. When he married a schoolteacher from Clearwater, a practical woman named Elizabeth with kind eyes and a ready laugh, I knew the ranch would be in good hands. They gave us 3 grandchildren, all boys, all as wild as their father had been at their age. The house rang with their laughter during holiday visits, and I thanked God for the blessing of family every single day. Sarah went east to study medicine, the first woman from our territory to do so. It was not an easy path she chose. The schools were reluctant to admit women, the professors skeptical of female intellect, the male students hostile to competition. But Sarah had inherited her mother's resilience and her father's stubbornness, and she refused to let any obstacle stand in her way. She wrote us letters about her studies, about the professors who doubted a woman could be a doctor, about her determination to prove them wrong. When she graduated at the top of her class, Violet and I made the long journey east to attend the ceremony, and I have never been prouder. She established a practice in Denver, specializing in women's health and childbirth. The women came to her in droves, grateful for a doctor who understood their bodies and their concerns, who did not dismiss their pain or minimize their fears. Sarah delivered hundreds of babies over the years, saved countless lives, and became one of the most respected physicians in the territory. She never married, though she had suitors aplenty. Her work was her life, her patients, her family. She came home to visit every Christmas, bringing stories of the city and the people she had helped. And James, sweet James, became a teacher, passing on his love of books to the next generation. He settled in Clearwater, married a widow named Martha with 2 young children who needed a father, and became the father figure they needed. He taught in the same one-room schoolhouse where he had learned his letters, inspiring generation after generation of children to love learning as he did. He brought his family to the ranch every summer, and I watched a new generation learn to ride and rope and love the land the way we did. We grew old together, Violet and I, in the stone house built into the hillside. The years took their toll on my body, slowing my step, bending my back, but they could not touch what I felt for her. Every morning, I woke grateful to find her beside me. Every evening, we sat by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence, grateful for the life we had built. She died in our bed on a cold winter night, much like the one when I had first found her. The children were all there, gathered around her, and she went peacefully, slipping away in her sleep with her hand in mine. I like to think her last dreams were happy ones, filled with sunshine and wildflowers and the sound of our children's laughter. I am an old man now, older than I ever expected to be. The ranch is in Thomas's capable hands, and I spend my days sitting by the fire, remembering. They come to visit often, my children and grandchildren, filling the house with noise and life. But when they leave, and the house grows quiet, I still feel her presence here. Still hear her voice in the crackling of the flames, still see her smile in the dancing shadows on the wall. She asked me once, many years ago, why I had helped her that night. Why I had wrapped my coat around a stranger, taken her into my home, given her shelter without asking for anything in return. And the truth is, I do not know. Something in me recognized something in her, perhaps. Two broken people finding each other in the storm. What I do know is this: she saved me as much as I saved her. Before she came, I was existing, not living. Going through the motions, waiting for death without really caring when it came. She gave me a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason to believe that broken things could be made whole again. She gave me a family, a home, a legacy that would outlive us both. Have you ever met someone who could not see their own worth? I have, and I spent the rest of my life showing her just how wrong she was. The fire burns low now, and outside the snow is falling again. Soon I will join her, wherever she has gone, and we will be together again. But not yet. Not quite yet. I have a little more time, a few more sunsets, a few more memories to gather, and when I finally close my eyes for the last time, I will do so with her name on my lips and gratitude in my heart. She said she was not worth much, she was worth everything, and I was the luckiest man alive that she stumbled out of that blizzard and into my arms.